On the day of a medically assisted death, I come to the patient's home. It usually is the patient's home. Sometimes it's hospital. I come with a nurse, and after going into the person's home and saying hello to them, I actually fairly quickly like to get the paperwork out of the way. So there's a consent form, which I ask them to sign. I'm very clear with them that they don't have to. We tell patients all along that they can change their mind at any time. But I ask them to sign the consent form. If they're not able to sign, the nurse will sign as their proxy. And then the nurse will insert 2 IV cannulas. The reason we use 2 is because we don't want, if something goes wrong with the first one, we want to be able to go straight to using the second one. Whilst the nurse is actually putting in the cannulas, I'll explain to the people who are with us and the patient, perhaps to take their mind of what's, the discomfort, what they're going to see, what's going to happen. So the medication is, there are 4 drugs, and we use them in a very particular order. So the first one is something called midazolam, and it simply puts the person to sleep. It relaxes them, makes them fall asleep. It takes about 30 to 40 seconds to work. And so I say to the patient that from their point of view, their medically assisted death will take about 30 or 40 seconds from when I start. What the rest of the family and friends will see is that I then inject something called lidocaine. It's a local anesthetic. It numbs the inside of the vein. The reason we use it is that the propofol, which is the 3rd drug, can cause a slight burning sensation. So because the patient is asleep and because they have got the lidocaine injected, they won't feel anything. People are very surprised by how many syringes are involved. The propofol comes in 4 big syringes. What it does is it puts the person into a coma. They're completely incapable of sensing anything, including the fact that the propofol also stops them breathing. The 4th drug is a drug called rocuronium. If the patient is still physically breathing after the propofol, then the rocuronium will stop that. I've never actually seen anybody still breathing after the propofol, but we always give the rocuronium anyway. Because the person's not breathing, no oxygen is getting into their body, and oxygen is obviously necessary for life. They're already not breathing. Their brain has already stopped working because they're in a coma. But then their heart will slow down and eventually stop. And when I think that it has or is about to, then I listen in with a stethoscope. And when it has stopped, I tell everybody present that the person's died. Now they'll see some changes, and there are some things that I hear. So with the first drug, with the midazolam, there's sometimes a bit of snoring. And with the propofol, sometimes, because everything's incredibly relaxed in the body, the exhalations right at the very beginning of the propofol can be a bit noisy, but then the person stops breathing, so that stops happening. And there's some colour changes. The person will become a bit dusky when they stop breathing with the propofol, and then very, very pale after their heart has stopped. But it's a very, very gentle, peaceful process. And when their heart has stopped, I tell everybody that the person has died. The nurse and I then leave. The family need to be by themselves to grieve together without anyone else present. So we go into a different room in the house. And then when we think they're ready for us to come back, we come back. The nurse will take out the IVs. We'll check to make sure that there isn't anything else that they need, remind them that they have to call the funeral home, and then when they're ready, we'll go. Grieving for a medically assisted death, though, is slightly different, I think, because coming up to it, people know exactly when and where it's going to happen. With a natural death, that's not certain. That the person is dying is known, but when the death's going to happen isn't. And I warn people when we start, during the assessment, and when we start talking about what their medically assisted death is going to be like, I'll very often say, now it's going to start getting a bit surreal, because we're actually planning your death. And I'll turn to a family member and say, this is going to be hard, what we're about to discuss, because we're talking about planning the death, helping your family member have their medically assisted death. You okay, Sydney? It's tough, isn't it?
It is hard, yeah.
I can tell.
Those details of just what we saw and everything. Mm-hmm. But it's important for people to know, so I want that in there. Because a lot of people are curious, and that's also part of my story too, is so many people asked afterwards.
Yeah, it's brave of you to do this though, it really is.
You as well. Hi.
Hey, come on in.
Oh, I just got really cold and
Take a
shaky.
seat, welcome.
Thanks.
How's it feeling on the other side?
Good. I actually just need to like stretch a little bit. I feel so tense. How was that for you?
That's good. How's it for you?
Good, and also just like surprising. You know, I thought I was through my grief or further along in my journey, and also realizing that it's not linear. It's not linear at all. I wasn't fully prepared for it, to be honest. And now I'm just trying to embrace it, because that's part of my journey right now.
My name is Jane Stirk. I'm Executive Director of Comox Valley Hospice Society. Grief is part of a human condition. We cannot go through a lifetime without grief. We experience grief right from the time that we're young children. It might be the death of an animal that was important in the family. It might be the death of a grandparent. And every time we experience grief, and there will be all kinds of reasons that we grieve in a lifetime, and they can be related to family members that die or close friends that die, but they can also be related to different parts of our life. If we lose a job or if we lose a house, COVID has brought enormous grief, both to individuals who've been impacted by COVID, but also to that loss of all the things that we took for granted. So grief is part of us, and it's an important part of us because it helps us learn to be compassionate, learn to be vulnerable, learn to be bigger than ourselves. It allows us, with each grief that we experience, it allows us to understand both grieving better, but ourselves better in the process of grieving. And I think that our society has kind of made grief a moment in time. You know, people often hear expressions like, well, why aren't you over it a couple of months after someone's died? And it's like an impossibility to get over grief. We grow through our grief, and we get bigger through our grief, and we get better as a person through our grief. And even if someone died years and years and years ago, or in my case, decades ago, the grief never stops. It just changes over time. And so one of the things that we try to do at hospice is to normalize grief, to make it talkable, to make it something that we can celebrate as an important part of every human passage from birth to death.
Some patients have no difficulty choosing the date. They are very clear that they want to have a medically assisted death. They often want it quite soon, and they say that's the date. For other patients, it's much more difficult. They're much more alert to the fact that that's somebody's birthday, and that's a wedding anniversary, and you can't do that because it's Easter, and I don't want it too close to Christmas. And they really do struggle to find a right date, and the difficulty comes when they say, I don't know, what do you think? And they turn to a family member and say, when should I have my medically assisted death? That is not an answer that can be given by a family member. It's not that it shouldn't, it's just they can't. It's too much to ask a family member. And so it does come down to the person needing to make a decision.
I remember talking to you, though, and we had talked about this a little bit, just about how she was so adamant about doing MAiD, and she had such a hard time deciding on a date. That was really interesting. And then I heard that that's really common. You know, that people going through it get so far and then they just can't pick their date. Because when Mom was asking me to pick her date for her, which I couldn't, and I put it back on her and just said, you know, I can't do this for you. It has to be you. What date would you like? She said, well, I want as soon as possible. But she couldn't. She knew as soon as possible was Tuesday, but she was having a really hard time saying,
That's the day.
that's the day. Yeah, she could say, I want it as soon as possible, and as soon as possible was Tuesday, but you decide. Mm-hmm. And so
What did you tell her when you said that you couldn't do it?
I just said that if I saw a look in her eye, if I couldn't choose, because if I saw a look in her eye at any point during the process that looked like she wasn't sure, I wouldn't be able to live with that. So I just told her I couldn't. And so she asked me to ask my dad, and I said no, that I couldn't put that on him either. And it was a good decision.
Yeah.
It felt really cruel at the time to not do that for her.
I know you called me and you were really, really upset about it, and yeah, it was the right decision, but that causes a lot of trauma while we're also trying to support Grandma. That was a whole different layer of things that I don't think we were prepared for at all. Like, oh my God, once you choose a day and then asking somebody else to choose a day for you.
Yeah, it was a lot. It was a lot, but she was brave and she chose her day and she didn't back down, and I have no doubt in my mind it was the right thing for her. Like, no doubt.
Yeah.
No doubt. And I think that's why we all felt such relief for her. And when we talked about Mom actually going, you and I have talked about it a little bit, just about what it felt like. And
When she died?
yeah, like to be, I mean, I don't even know if I've ever seen one of my pets die. Like, I usually have to leave the room. And to be holding her hand and to be have her say that and then close her eyes and go to sleep, and yeah.
Many people who choose to have a medically assisted death, they are planners. They are choosers. This is about autonomy. This is about them deciding when their death is going to occur, not nature. They're making a decision. And those people have less of a problem.
Can you tell me about and I think it's still this way, the 10 days that
It's gone.
is gone?
I remember, and this is actually available on the web, there's a very good video called Saying Goodbye for the Last Time by a guy called David Miller. And he describes his wife. She was one of our very first patients. And he described in a talk that he gave when he was showing the video to a group how he had opened the fridge and taken out a carton of milk. And the best before date was going to be after his wife's planned death. And he found that, I think, difficult, but just it was notable. It was something that, you know, wouldn't happen with a natural death. So there are differences.
After hearing about Dave Miller's story, I realized I actually knew his daughter, Millie. I wanted to hear from someone like me, who had more time and experience with grief.
I'm having a moment. You're gonna see it. It's okay. Come on in. Hey. Hi. This is me.
It's you.
So what you're seeing right now is just me having gone through a big conversation with Jonathan and just feeling a little shaky.
Oh, shoot.
It's okay.
Yeah?
It just,
Do you want me to lay down with you?
Sure, if you want to.
Yeah.
Yeah. We were just talking about grief.
Oh, shit. Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That was my entire morning of, I was like, hey, Dad, can I chat with you for a bit? And learning new stuff that I'd never known before about the process and my mom's side of things, and had a really intense moment with my dad about like stuff that we haven't talked about in like 6 years. So
Yeah.
it's normal, and honestly I feel like it's something that's never gonna go away. It's just something that you don't ever not feel it. You just kind of learn to live with it. It just becomes a part of you, honestly. And you find people who have gone through the exact same situation. And something that I've learned, that grief is grief, and you find ways of letting yourself just feel it. And also all your feelings are valid. It's never supposed to be easy. In my head, I feel like once it gets easy, I've forgotten. And I almost feel like that grief and that pain is that little bit of them that's still inside of me. And I almost feel like when my time has come, I hope that I'm never forgotten. Because, I mean, not that I would ever wish that upon anybody, but knowing that if all we have of them now is a memory, that I don't want that to go away. Because I'd rather feel that grief and feel that pain, and almost with me it's a sense of feeling completely out of control, is and then focusing on what you can control, which is your breathing, and focusing on a single thing, whether it's a memory or a smell or even a color that reminds me of them.
Witnessing death, I think, can be a transformative moment in a life. Death can be very profound, and it can be a very special moment, and it can feel sacred, and it can bring you a greater understanding of life. I mean, this magical moment when a person transitions. Generally, when it happens, you will see a coming in toward the person who has died. And there's a process after death where the person is still there, still bringing the loved ones together. And I think that's that physical moving in toward the person's body at that moment. They're still bringing them together. They're still hanging around for a while. Often people believe and experience the person watching over them for the rest of their lifetime, knowing that their spirit, their entity, their presence is still very much a part of their life. We would wish that, I think, for anyone who dies, that we have that feeling of sacredness, that feeling of wonder, that feeling of amazement, and having to rethink our relationship and reconstitute it in a different way is, I think, the journey of the rest of our lives in coming to terms with the person who has died.